Hi, this is Kim from Emerging Creatively Tutorials, and this is ECT TV, episode 45. Today we're going to be making this fun bracelet. I use these really colorful small glass beads, but you can really use any bead that you like. And it's just fun. I hadn't found a pair of earrings that I had that I didn't have any other jewelry that matched that were kind of rainbow and fun and colorful, and this bracelet will go great with it. So let's get started. So these are the materials and tools you'll need to make this bracelet. So first of all, you'll need beading wire, and I like this AccuFlex 49 strand beading wire. It has a nice drape. It doesn't get tangled up. It's kind of nice and soft, and that's kind of what you get when you use like the 49 strand wires, but you don't necessarily need to use that. You could use something with less strands that doesn't cost quite as much, and this bracelet will still be great. You will need some beads. So I have this big bag of beads that I actually got from the thrift store recently. If you saw my thrift store haul video, I showed you. But basically these are just little glass beads, almost. They're kind of irregular, but they're the size of the larger seed beads. So you'll need a bunch of those. So you can use whatever beads you like. I'm going to show you the technique, and you don't need to use small beads. You can use larger beads, whatever you like. Of course, like any tutorial I show you, you can really decide what materials you want to use. You will also need a couple crimp beads, and then optional crimp bead covers, and then you may want to use wire guards, but again, that's up to you. You will need a clasp. I'm going to be using this toggle clasp, and you will need a bunch of head pins. I like to use 2-inch head pins, but for the beads I'm using, I definitely don't need to use that large of head pin, but that's just what I always have on hand. You will also need wire cutters, round nose pliers, chain nose pliers, and you may need a pair of bent nose pliers. And you'll also need a crimp tool. So we're going to get started. So I started by dumping a bunch of beads into a tray so I can more easily use them. I have multicolored beads, and I like the idea that they're kind of all mixed up with no real pattern, to them. So that's how I'm going to use them. So I'm just going to leave them in the tray and just pick them up as I go along. And you're also going to need head pins to get started. So we're going to be making bead dangles, or I call them bead dangles, or they're wire wrapped head pins. And so we're going to make those first, and you'll need, depending on the size of your beads and depending on the size of your wrist, about 15, but if you're using larger beads, you may need less. If you have a smaller wrist, you may need less. So that's something you might have to experiment with just a little bit. So to get started, I'm going to show you how to make a bead dangle the way I do it, and I think it's an easy way to make them. So let me show you that. So we're going to make a bead dangle, as I call it, or some people call it a wire wrapped head pin. So for mine, I am going to be using 2 of my small beads. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide on 2 beads. Like I said, I'm just randomly choosing colors. And then you just want to make sure that the beads don't slide off the end, that the little head on it holds them. If you have a problem where the holes in the beads are wider than that little head, then what you can do is either get a smaller bead, slide that on first so the beads don't fall off, or you can make your own head pins so that you can design the bottom of it, make a decorative head pin, and then the bead won't slide off. If you want to make a decorative head pin, you can go on my YouTube channel. I have several different types that you can choose from if that's what you want to do. Okay, and I've shared a tip in the past that when you're working on a project and you're going to be making a lot of wire wrapped loops, you want the loops to all be uniform. So what you can do is make a mark with your Sharpie on your round nose pliers so that you'll be lining up the wire at the same spot for every single head pin, and then you know all the loops will be the same. So that's a little tip for you. I do not have that really done. The mark does eventually just kind of wear off, and which is fine, and you can always put a new one on there. So you want to hold the head pin in your round nose pliers, and then if you did make a mark, just make sure the head pin lines up with that mark, and then you want to leave just a tiny little bit of space in between the beads and the pliers, so maybe just a little bit more than the size of the wire. And then you're going to wrap the wire down toward you and around the one barrel of the pliers. You're not going to go completely around, but the wire will come in between the beads and the pliers. So then you're just going to remove your round nose pliers. So now you have this crooked loop on top of your beads. So I've just grabbed my chain nose pliers. I'm going to hold that loop in my chain nose pliers, and then I'm going to wrap around one time, and while I'm doing that, I'm pulling out the beads. And so I've wrapped around one time. And so now that loop is straight. If it's not, just fix it. And now I'm going to switch hands. And in my other hand, I have my bent nose pliers. You could use another pair of pliers. If you have to use round nose pliers, then you just want to hold it by the wire by the very tip, because they will leave a mark, and then you make sure you cut that tip off that you use. Otherwise, just use any pliers that are flat on the inside. And then you're just going to continue to wrap around. And I like to go around 3 times, but whatever feels good to you. So then, since I'm using these long head pins, I have to cut off the extra. So I'm just going to trim off the extra wire with my wire cutters. And then I'm grabbing my chain nose pliers again and just making sure that end is not poking up. So just pushing it in. You can just run your finger over it to make sure it's not poking out too. So that is your first bead dangle, and like I said, it depends on the project, the beads that you're using for the project, and the size of your wrist, exactly how many you'll need. But for my purposes, for these little beads, I'm going to need about 15. So I'm going to go ahead and make those. Okay, so I have all my bead dangles ready to go. So we're going to start beading this bracelet. So grab my tray of beads, and then I just cut a piece of beading wire. I just measured around my wrist, and then I just leave a few extra inches on each side. So probably about 6 inches. And then I'm going to use my super handy trick. If you have a bead stop, you can put that at the end of your wire, or you could just put a piece of tape like I like to do. And then I'm just going to bead 2 beads onto my wire. So just slide them right on. And then my trusty tape will catch them so they don't fall off the other side. And then I'm going to add a bead dangle. And then I'm going to add 2 more beads. And like I said, I'm just randomly picking out beads. I'm not doing any sort of pattern. And so that's just how it's going to go. So I'm doing 2 beads, a bead dangle, and then 2 beads, and then a bead dangle, and then 2 more beads, and then you just want to go until your bracelet will fit nicely around your wrist. So I'm not going to do this on camera because that would be very boring to watch, but I think you get the idea. If you're not using these small beads or using a different type of bead, you might want to just use 1 bead if your beads are larger, or you might just want to use 1 bead even if they are smaller. You know, you might just want to experiment a little bit. When we're done, everything will be pushed up close to each other. So like that. Just go ahead and bead so the bracelet will fit. Okay, so I have my bracelet beaded. So there's 2 small beads in between each bead dangle, and I ended with 2 beads. And so now we're just going to finish it up by adding a clasp. So if you've seen my other tutorials on beading, then you know that I like to use 2 crimp beads on each end, and this isn't necessary if you're not using really heavy beads, but I just always do because that's the way I've always done it, and I just feel more secure that way. So the way I do this is I add tiny little crimp bead, and then I add a bead. So I add a small bead. I'm using small beads for my bracelet, so they're perfect. And then another crimp bead. Now, if you want to use a wire guard, you would place that on now. Or if you're just going to use your clasp, then you can just add one side. So I'm just going to add my clasp. If you want to see how to use a wire guard, you can see my previous episode on that. So I'm just kind of bending the wire back around, and then you feed the wire back through the crimp bead, that bead that's in between the 2 crimp beads, and through the crimp bead again. And then I like to go through a couple more beads in the bracelet itself. So I'm just going to pull them up now. And then you want to pull it tight, but not too tight. So you want to be able for this to still, the clasp to still kind of move around. You don't want it to be that tight that it wouldn't move. And then you're going to get your crimp tool, and it has 2 notches in it. So one that's closer to the handle, that's bigger, and one that's closer to the tip, that's smaller. You start with the larger. So you just go ahead and put your bead in there, and then you go to the smaller one. So when you did the larger one, it kind of smushed the bead down and put a little crease in the middle, and then the smaller one will fold it in half. Oops. And there we go. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other crimp bead. So just make sure you have everything pulled up when you do this. And there we go. And then I'm actually going to use 2 crimp bead covers on my crimp beads. Let me grab them. And they just kind of look like little clams or little C's. So I just actually line them up in my crimp tool so the opening is out, and then I just slide it right over top of the crimp bead and then close it. And when you close it, it should just look like a regular bead. Okay. Alright, so I'm just going to slide a couple more beads through that second wire, and then you just pull all the beads down, and then I just kind of leave that on until the end. And you just want to make sure too that your crimps are holding and everything. And then you're just going to repeat the exact same thing on the other end with the other side of the clasp. Okay, and now we're just going to trim off the excess wire very closely to the bead. And that is the bracelet. So that's really fun. Mine's super colorful, and I hope you have fun with it.